Welcome, and welcome back, everybody, the OK Grognard Show. It is Thursday, February 25th, 2021, 10 a.m. Central, in beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Lovely, beautiful, finally seeing some regular days over 40 degrees, Wisconsin. Yeah, baby, that's right. Today we're going to look at approaches to playing AD&D. This is a rather short section, really, in the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, page 9, if you're familiar. And I think it's worth remembering that this was published in 79, so it really completed more along the lines of 78. What's up, Rick? Welcome to the chat. And the ideas on playing role-playing games of any kind were less than a decade old. In fact, calling them role-playing games wasn't even something they were doing until after they were published, essentially. They were people that were playing them, that were playtesting them with Gary and with Dave in Minnesota, were used to playing mainly war games and board games, and of course some standard card games. And the idea of a role-playing game, this was just a different way to game. It wasn't really very well defined insofar as analysis of gameplay was concerned. They were feeling their way. So the section's going to reflect a certain, hate to say it, naivete, I suppose. Um, Inexperience, even. As experienced as they were, the most experienced with playing this type of game, they were still inexperienced in so far as anybody playing that type of game, that genre of gaming. So, well, we'll go into the section in a little bit and we'll talk about it. Ethereal GaryCon. Hey, IF. You're gonna have to type in there and tell me how you came up with that name, because I know I know where Mandalorian Man comes from. Bongo Catnip. How you doing there? Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Hey, I wanted to announce something. Gary Con reached out to me and asked me if I'd like to give away a badge to Ethereal GaryCon 13, that is virtual GaryCon, coming up at the end of March. Oop, what is that? 25th to 28th. There we go. Well, we got all the information. 25th to 28th of March. So, if you're interested, all you need to do is be a follower of the channel here and to chime in, as some people already have, during the show in the stream chat, which is, feel free to jump into the discussion as we go on. Whenever you're here, whenever anything's on the table. But if you just want to say hello, that's fine. You don't need to. You don't need to go overboard. Don't feel like you need to be put on the spot or anything. Just a hi. Say hi. 2 letters. There you go. So if you are in the stream chat now and you haven't said hi, then say hi. You'll be eligible for a. Oh, bum. Henry Armitage. There you go. Thanks for coming out today. Well, let's see. We were going to talk about section of the 1E DMG. That is the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. This is the classic cover. There are other covers for it. Well, one other cover for it. Two others. But this was the original 79 cover. And on page 9, there is a section called Approaches. We'll slide me over just a little bit there. There we go. Approaches to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. To playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Hey, Misty. Thanks for joining us. The section begins. A few brief words are necessary to ensure that the reader has actually obtained a game form which he or she desires. Of the two approaches to hobby games today, I'm going to interject some things here and there, and let me start by doing a little interjection here. Hobby games. I don't know that we even call them that in a general sense. Of course, they're not saying tabletop games. There weren't video games when this came out, or at least there were only a couple of computers on college campuses in the U.S. and maybe elsewhere. I'm not even sure about that. That had programs on them that would be considered the early forms of computer games, and they were text-based mainly when they first came out. So hobby games included war games, board games, card games, and now this new form, which is really only 5 years old when the DMG was published in '79, of role-playing games. It continues. Of the two approaches, he says, is it broken down more now? Two approaches to hobby games today. One is best defined as the realism-simulation school, and the other as the game school. AD&D is assuredly an adherent of the latter school. It does not stress any realism, parentheses, in the author's opinion, an absurd effort at best considering the topic, and he's talking about the idea that it's a fantasy world, right, in which the game takes place. It does little to attempt to simulate anything either. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is first and foremost a game for the fun and enjoyment of those who seek to use imagination and creativity. That sentence, I think, is undeniable. George, welcome. Pong, Mandalorian Man. Absolutely. When it comes to those early computer games, definitely. We had a little two-knob Pong game when that first came out. That was a lot of fun back then. You could play for hours. A test of hand-eye coordination. Gary continues, this is not to say that where it does not interfere with the flow of the game, that the highest degree of realism hasn't been attempted. But neither is a serious approach to play discouraged. In all cases, however, the reader should understand that AD&D is designed to be an amusing and diverting pastime, something which can fill a few hours or consume endless days, as the participants desire, but in no case something to be taken too seriously. Hello, Internet, are you listening? Howie the Scorpion. Thank you. Yeah, I saw, Howie, that you followed this morning, earlier, soon after that post I made, I think. George says, I remember the tabletop Pong in the local Pizza Hut way back in 80 or so. Absolutely. It was neat. They had those little laid down tabletop versions, and you could sit across from each other and play the same game or next to one another, and then eat your pizza and have your. Can you imagine that? Inventing a electronic game today in which people were encouraged to eat on top of it and put their sweating soda bottles and cups up on top of the game. Of course, they had a thick plexiglass top, but what are you going to do? So, a diverting pastime not to be taken too seriously. In no case something to be taken too seriously. For fun, excitement, and captivating fantasy, AD&D is unsurpassed. As a realistic simulation of things from the realm of make-believe, or even as a reflection of medieval or ancient warfare, or culture, or society, it can be deemed only a dismal failure. Readers who seek the latter must search elsewhere. Those who desire to create and populate imaginary worlds with larger-than-life heroes and villains, who seek relaxation with a fascinating game, and who generally believe games should be fun, not work, will hopefully find this system to their taste. I think it's pretty interesting that the analysis of those types of games, game school, realism simulation school, are not overly defined. I think when Gary wrote this, he felt for the most part that the terms spoke for themselves. I think the idea of realism and simulation are fairly self-explanatory, and the fact that the game school, in opposition or in contrast to realism simulation, isn't really defined at all, except in what it is not, in how it is not realism, how it is not, except in very loose terms, simulation. And I think mainly he would also contrast war games and most board games, non-war game board games of the time, as realism simulation school or game school. And while there were a fair number of board games with some war aspects that were put out by war game companies like Avalon Hill, even like SPI by 79, while there were a fair number of board games that weren't strictly war games, Civilization comes to mind, um, which is a game that basically requires you to deal in area control, resource management, and um, proceeding along a tech tree. And while is a possibility of minor of battles from area to area, certainly not the way to win the game, and certainly not a huge aspect of it. So one can only say that Civilization, in the strictest of terms, is probably not a war game. Some people would say that Kingmaker, which has a fair amount of battles and war within it, some people would say that the main focus of that is not war, and thus perhaps not a war game. So when they were, and then on the flip side of the coin, you've got things as mundane or popular as Monopoly, but also if you look at Risk, uh, some people don't consider that a war game per se, although the main focus of it is war. Probably good to mention something like Stratego. I think most people are familiar with that. It's definitely a game that requires control, and like the earliest, or one of the earliest war games ever, chess plays on a grid. You have a number of pieces. They attack one another until you control the game, and then you win. So there are definitely aspects of popular parlor games like Risk and Stratego, which you'd have to say they veer closer toward being war games. The Game of Life, Clue, Chutes and Ladders, games like that, I think squarely in the definitions here in the game school. So there are some that straddle the line, but I think if you examine them close enough and had to make a decision on one side or the other of the line, mainly you'd push them one way or the other. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, though, there's certainly a lot of combat, certainly a lot of battles. One could argue that it's more wargamey, but Gary's careful here to not divide the hobby games hobby into war games and not war games, or board games and not board games. I think there must have been some awareness, and I think a lot of articles of the time, interviews with Gary and or Dave would have put forth. George says, "Watch out for the bombs in Stratego and the spies." I think that Gary and others who were playing had to realize that this was something new, that this was separate from other games that had been created, that were being played, and that were being defined in areas. Because one could just say games and it covers all of this. But they had already made some distinctions between board games and war games, and of course card games, all unto themselves, no matter what they were portraying. Um, so when you look at that, you can't easily say, well, this is one of those two or closer to one of those two, and thus closer or in one of these categories or the other. So you kind of have to look at games, hobby games as a whole, in a different way. Realism simulation school, game school. I'm not sure, as I just said before, that this necessarily is the best way to divvy up hobby games because of the fact that you really don't define one except as it is not like the other. Realism simulation, though. What games truly cover one, the other, or both categories of realism and simulation? I think a lot of war games purport to be simulationist in that they are meant to have mechanics that fairly assess the actual strengths, weaknesses, and other attributes of real world troops or vehicles or terrain, all of the different things that come into play when you're actually making a war game, and then attempts to balance them in such a way that they reflect one another value-wise in a way that is realistic and allows you to then play that game simulating a situation, a battle, a war, a conflict of one kind or another. So when you think about that in terms of uh, war game units that might have a strength, attack strength, a defense strength, a movement, um, and all of the other things that make up individual units in a war game, one has to say that the individual characters in a role-playing game such as AD&D are definitely granulated much more deeply. 6 ability scores, hit points, armor class, all of these things are, I think, broken out from the types of things that used to be defined in war games to create a simulation game. Is it fair to say that, hey, Hobbsy, welcome? One of these things is not like the other. Bob Quick also says the only thing approaching a war game I ever tried was the old Starship Troopers game. Oh yeah, that was crazy. I mean, the earliest scenarios are just dropping onto a planet and shooting up all the bugs, right? But that came with a fair number of scenarios that were either skirmish level or large war, large battle level, were missions, usually with objective markers that were placed out on the hexagrid board. Capture the flag type scenarios. So, yeah, definitely a war game. Lots of fun too. In the skinnies, that's right. So, I think it's fair to say that a lot of what makes up the rules of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and D&D, its predecessor, are certainly attempts to use the same approach mechanically as war games of the day, uh, and to go into finer detail to create a uh, more in-depth experience, since you were meant to be playing a single individual rather than to be running a battle with multiple units, multiple individuals in each and every unit, larger scale. And even when you think about skirmish games, even if you have a leader and a handful of other figures that are in a, say, skirmish miniatures battle, for instance, um, one could say, well, I'm this guy, I'm the leader guy, and since I'm making the decisions and passing out the orders, and since they may or may not follow them, if you have morale rules and that sort of thing, or if you play a game that has command points where you have to take make definite decisions about how you place your orders and who you give your orders to. I think even in situations like that, got to term that a war game, but isn't that so much closer again to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons? Uh, is it not simulationist in that approach, in that area? Isn't it? Is it not an attempt at realism, at least insofar as that portion of the game is concerned? Dragons? Okay, they don't exist. Can we have a war game where there are dragons? Of course you can. I regularly play a game called Divine Right. It's an early TSR hex and chit war game set in a fantasy realm. It's area control. You have a bunch of units. You're constantly warring with one another. You're attempting to find extra items or things and allies that will help you to be victorious over everyone else. There are points given, victory points given for definite objectives like taking castles. And without a doubt, taking out other leaders. Without a doubt, that is a war game. There are dragons in it, though. There are elves, there are dwarves, there are trolls, there are goblins. So there's magic. Now, magic obviously is one of those things that will make you want to say that something is not part of the realism simulation school. However, if one looks at magic as simply a metaphor for technology, uh, is analogous to technology, and the attempts to define how magic works are done with the same mechanics that you define everything else: range, duration, damage in hit points. All of those are attempts to uh, put this within a sort of a realistic physics sort of surrogate. So, isn't it an attempt at a simulation? Isn't it an attempt at an alternate realism? Maybe you should say alt realism simulation as the opposing school. I don't know. Food for thought, something to think about. When I read this section just recently, that kind of came to mind, and I wanted to discuss it a little bit. It's early. It's page 9 in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. So have a look for yourself at some point and think about what I said and think about what other people are saying about games. Now, of course, this is early. This is the 70s. There's been a lot more analysis. Right, Bob? Thank you. Thanks for listening. The the level of analysis of games has expanded and become a lot more complex. Perhaps some would say a lot more interesting. Some would say some of it's borders on navel gazing. But however deep you want to get into this, I think it's worth remembering, as far as this passage is concerned, that this is fairly early in game design. It's certainly in this genre. Well, I think the old clock on the wall, is telling us it's about time to finish up here. So I'm going to say thanks to everybody who popped into the chat today. What do we got here? Artanis, are you in here? I'm just looking at the list. Give us a little hello. Lemon Juices 12. I think the two of you have not chimed in on the chat. There you go. There's Artanis. Lemon Juices 12. What do we got here? All right. Well, I'm going to pick a random person from the chat that has chimed in on the stream chat today. I'm going to, as I said earlier, set them up with a badge from GaryCon 13. If you've already got one, feel free to tell me that you'd like to let someone else have it uh, from the chat, or that you'd like to pass it on to a friend or family member who hasn't got a badge yet that would like to participate in Virtual GaryCon. So you just let me know when I contact you. It'll be pretty fast. I'll probably have to use messages here unless I already know you in some other way and can contact you more easily elsewise. Let me also say thanks to everybody who is here and follows the show and chimes in on the stream chat. It's very much appreciated. If you catch up with these shows on YouTube, please do subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up on shows that you watch and or enjoy. I guess you got to watch them to enjoy them, right? Feel free to make comments in the comment section on YouTube as well. Remember, the shows, the OK Grognard Show comes to you 10 a.m. Central on Monday and Thursday, live stream on Twitch, and is subsequently uploaded over to YouTube, usually within the hour. So feel free to watch it over there. I want to say thanks once again to everybody who's involved, everybody who's enjoying it, and everybody who helps us make it better. This is the OK Grognard Show from beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Bye-bye.